وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أم حسبت أن أصحاب الكهف والرقيم كانوا من آياتنا عجبا. صدق الله العلي العظيم. زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Islam and Iman, here in Melbourne or across the globe, wherever you're hearing my voice, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: what is the relationship between culture and religion? We've come to the culmination and the conclusion of our series, and on this we've discussed several topics and many things. And one thing that I would like to conclude on is trying to lay the foundation of what's next. And in that, one of the conversations that comes in is that of culture and religion. And within culture, you'll find many dimensions of culture. You'll find identity, you'll find the sense of communication, and how you interact. And when it comes to this, and we recite the verse, Inna Dina Indallahi al-Islam, from the Quran, that verily the deen of Allah is Islam, that means that it must have some guidance even on communication. It must have some guidance on culture, on society. And so I want to look at very quickly tonight, without burdening you too much, some things that can help us as a community living in Australia, living in Melbourne, or living wherever you may be hearing my voice, about how one reconciles, looking at the future of Islam, how do you manage and reconcile what you may have grown up with, or where you may have seen from past generations, with the modern world and the modern civilizations that you may be living in? And how is it that Islam may have actually been quite different, historically how it was practiced, and in our modern world maybe we have forgotten that. In order so that at the end of the day we can know what is true Islam, number one, number two, and how does Islam solve our problems today in our world, in our society. And ultimately, how can we raise the next generation that really follows more so than us in the Husseini movement, even better than us. Not one that is just like us, one that improves over time. That they become better followers of Ahlul Bayt than us, and their generation inshallah better. Not that they just keep the identity and that's sufficient. How do we progress, inshallah? And that's what we'll conclude on tonight, especially being the soil of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. This is our agenda for tonight, wherever you are here in Melbourne or across the globe. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. On the onset, one of the things that comes, and one of the topics that people many a time say, is culture versus religion. They put culture and religion at odds. And so they'll say, for example, culture says this, religion says that. So you'll find a few categories of people. One category of people will say culture is all bad. And then you'll find another that says culture is all that matters. Only culture, 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 no religion even. And then there's another group that's trying to figure out what is the reality between these two. And so I want to share with you something that's happened in other communities where I come from. For example, in America. In America, the Jewish community had a survey that they would administer to their community every 10 years. And the survey is called the NJPS, National Jewish Population Survey. They stopped administering it in the year 2000 because the results were so clear. There was no need to continue. So for example, they asked certain questions to the members of their community. They asked them, for example, how Jewish are you? What makes you Jewish? And several other questions. For example, are you religiously Jewish? Are you culturally Jewish? Or both? And so when it came to this, they asked them, how Jewish are you? For example, how important is that identity to you? So if you meet someone down the street in Melbourne, or you meet someone, is Jewish identity how you identify yourself? Or you'll say that maybe you'll say I'm Australian, or I'm Pakistani, or Afghani, or something else, or is that identity come up or no? And so for some people they said, yes, our Jewish identity is important to us. Then they asked them, how are you Jewish? As in, what do you do that makes you Jewish? So do you go to synagogue or temple, or do you do do the fast of the year? Do you commemorate Yom Kippur? Do you commemorate, Hanukkah? What makes you Jewish? And so some of them answered, and some of them said, not really sure. And then they asked the big question, which was, are you religiously Jewish, culturally Jewish, or, both? And they found, when they asked this question, from the numbers, they found that roughly 15% or so said that they were religiously Jewish. Then when you came to the numbers, you found about 20% said they were both. And when it came to the rest, 65% of them said we are only culturally Jewish. And the trend was showing that for a long time. And so that's why in the year 2000 they said, I think it's clear we don't need to do this anymore. So now this is one side of the equation. Now, what does Islam say about culture and religion? You find Islam, when it comes to the deen of Allah, it either accepted, rejected, or transformed the culture of the time. So, it took some aspects that the Arabs already had that were good, such as sakhawa, for example, and it kept those. It rejected others, such as racism. It says no racism, where Rasulullah says, not my words, the Emir Stein Institute in America and Rice University said the first documented anti-racist in history is Muhammad. So Islam said, no Arab is better than a non-Arab, no non-Arab is better than an Arab, except on the basis of taqwa. As you know, they had divided the world into Arab and Ajam at the time. Arab were those who spoke Arabic, and Ajam were those who didn't, referring to Fars and other places. But do you know where Ajam comes from, the root word? It literally means someone who's mute. They don't know how to speak. That's how much pride they had in their Arabic language. So this is how the world was divided. But Rasul said, no, it's taqwa that differentiates people. And so this is something to know. And so some things it rejected outright. It outright rejected some of the tribes who used to kill their daughters alive. Islam rejected it right away. But then certain things it transformed. So for example, it transformed the Hajj. The Hajj was already being done, but Islam brought it in and it made it towards Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purely. Number one. For example, it transformed the institution of, as you see, the Qabila, as I mentioned the other night. I'm reminding you of this. The tribe was the most important thing in Arabia at the time, and Allah expanded the tribe to include the Ummah. Now comes the issue that we're facing a lot in our world, is that are we supposed to be culturally Muslim or religiously Muslim, or are culture and religion at odds, or what? And you'll find that if you look at those places historically, which had a large Muslim population, historically, elements of their culture are Islamic in some sense, and elements of it are not. And sometimes this is good and bad. Because sometimes it's good because Islamic culture is sort of embedded in the culture already. So when you get the culture, you get some Islam too. But the problem on the other side is, it becomes difficult for the common person to know what is religion and what is culture. And then they blend the two and then they're confused. So confusion happens. So this is another challenge that is faced there. So we need to be aware of this. So now coming to our world and our society, looking at what we're facing, we are facing an environment where the Quran is our constitution, Islam is our constitution, and in trying to reconcile that, we're living in Australia or Melbourne in 2023, or the US or United Kingdom or wherever you're hearing my voice, and we're trying to figure out what is culture for here, what is culture from back home, what is our own culture, and what is our religious principles and how do we manage these things. So to this end, I want to look at a few things with you very quickly. That is, what is Islam's concept of culture and by virtue communication? Does Islam say anything about this, about how we interact with one another or not? And to this end, I'll tell you this because many of us may come from countries that in the past, if you go maybe to Pakistan or you go to Afghanistan or Iran or Iraq, each country has its own culture. So for example, when sociologists study Iraq, they say Iraq is more, it's a more paternal society, more masculine society in terms of their culture, of what they emphasize. And when they compare that to Iran, sociologists say Iran is not as paternal and masculine, in terms of its cultural focus as Iran is. Iran has, that's why they would argue that women have more rights, relatively speaking, because of the society. Now, it's not Islam, but this is what the culture of the society is. First point. Each culture has a different dynamic. Now, why am I saying that? Because you may come from a society where the culture was such, that the environment was such, that there's husband, wife, children, this is the family, but the family is not only husband, wife, children, the family is also grandparents, in-laws, the family is also the concept of, there are some rules, or I should say, some norms of society, that for example, the mother gets married and she stays at home, and for example, the husband goes and works, and then the children are raised by the mother, for example. This is one concept. And now when you come to a place like Australia, the dynamics are different, the culture is different, the society may be very different. Whereas that's not how they see family and how it may see. Now what complicates this even further is, I said the they, because I'm from America, but for you, it's we. Because you become part and parcel of the fabric of the society, whether you realize it or not. I'm trying to explain and trying to reflect with you on what is part and parcel of the identity crisis that our next generation is facing. Why are they facing it? Because we've not been able to reconcile some of these things. So sometimes we think what we grew up with is necessarily culture, or sometimes we realize that maybe it's all culture and all wrong. And the reality is, we have to be mindful of understanding first, how do people see things? I'll give you an example. I was in the United States, and I was speaking, as you know, in the United States, we're on to our second and third and fourth generations of the community. And so we've learned certain things. So now, there's this brother who is the leader of a community. He's the president of a community. And he says, Sayyid, you need to talk to these people. He's a little frustrated. I said, what happened? So he's in the second generation, born and raised in the US, and now he's the president, he's done pretty well for himself, he's the leader of the community. Very practicing, very religious, huh? He dedicated his whole life to the community. His parents and that generation, they came first generation. And his kids are now the third generation. So he's in between the first generation and the third generation. And so now he's living there, and he said, you need to talk to these people. I'm just sharing it with you as a journalist, for example, what happened. I'm not giving you my view. I'm just saying this is what happened. So he said, Siddhi, you need to talk to these people. I said, what do you mean? These elders in these communities. So what do you mean? He said, I respect them, I love them, they're my life, but, they need help. I said, what do you mean they need help? He said, we were cleaning the masjid, the mosque, the Husainiya, the Imam Baragah. They had spring cleaning, and so they were cleaning the masjid. So the community got together, and they started cleaning the masjid. When they began to clean the masjid, they came to the time to clean the zari room, the Ashur Khana, where the alams and the zari and all the tazia are. Now, at that point in time, they were making all the cleaning arrangements there, and one of the elder aunts or mothers, who we have so much respect for, she said to me, to the president, can you pass me the stick? So this was a stick of a alam, but it was not in alam form yet. It was just a stick at that point in time in his mind. So he said he picked it up and he passed it. And when he passed it, this elderly lady, aunt, mother, who's a member of our community, who's so respected, she became very upset. She said, what did you do? You disrespected it. You did be'adabi. You did disrespect of this. And he's thinking, I'm thinking to myself, disrespect of what? This is a stick. And he said, you need to talk to them. They are doing shirk and idol worship. And I said, and I thought about this, and I said, look, at that moment it was just a stick, and the alam was not on it, the flag was not on it, it had not been done. But this is a difference of perspective based on upbringing, culture, and society. To you, from where you were looking at this, perhaps, yes, it was just a stick. But for her, it was not just a stick, it was the stick. The stick meaning what? It was the stick of the alam of Hazrat Abul Fadl Abbas. And she could not separate that from the stick. But for you, you were able to separate the two. And so what you realize from this is the same reality, the same haqiqah, and how I may look at it, and how my son or my grandson will look at the same thing is very different. How they will see the alam, and what an alam represents and is symbolic of, may be very different than how we do. There was a reason why the constitution of alam and taziyah came, and it was a very good reason. As one of the poets says very beautifully, Roz rozae shehbar, kaise haziri hogi. You see, if you're living in Pakistan or Afghanistan or India, at that time it wasn't an easy trip to go to Iraq or Iran to do ziyarah or to go to Makkah, Medina. It was a long trip. Roz rozae shehbar, kaise haziri hogi. Hasrate ziyarat ne taziya bana dala. The idea that the wanting and the eagerness to go for the ziyarah made these taziyah. So when that generation came up and did the concept, the alam comes from, of course, Karbala, but the form that came in India, Pakistan, and other places, that form, we may not have transferred that to the next generation. So now, come to the Quran. When the Quran says to communicate, what does the Quran tell us about? And this may be the solution to many of the problems we're facing here and globally, about how to deal with father-son, mother-daughter, parent-child interactions, how to deal with husband-wife interactions, how to deal with relationships at large. Because why? In places where you and I may have come from, or our ancestors came from, marriage was Islamic, yes, number one, but number two, it may have been a cultural, societal necessity. So the culture was such that the girl gets married to a man, the man provides, the woman looks after the children. But in a society like Australia or America or Canada, you don't need to have a family relation. You don't need to be married. You don't need, in their perspective. They'll say, we'll stay together as long as we want, and if it doesn't work, we'll move on. The kids, we'll split time, whatever it is. So in an environment like Australia, you cannot just say, you need to get married. You need to want to get married, and also have a foundation of love and respect in the marriage. And in that, we need to understand, how do we communicate? How do we interact? How do we show love, respect, affection between spouses, between children, and between society? I want to share something with you in order to understand this. Korean Airlines. I don't know if any of you have flown Korean Airlines. MashaAllah, this is not the case now, but this was in the past. In the past, Korean Airlines used to have a very bad record of plane crashes. In the 90s, in the 80s, they had a very high rate of plane crashes, to the point that even their own premier said, I'm not going to fly the airline, I'm going to use another Korean airline, I'm not going to use Korean Air. I mean, imagine, you're the Prime Minister of Pakistan, you're saying, I'm not going to use PIA, I'm going to use another airline. So that was the situation. Now, what was the reason? There have been a few reasons in terms of this, but they launched an investigation to look at why were they having more crashes than everyone else. They have the same plane, same technology, same training, same everything. Why were there more crashes? Now, we don't know definitively what the answer is, but one of the hypotheses and one of the guesses and the analysis of what has come out is the following. This is what they say. They launched an investigation into why this airline seemingly had a higher rate of crashes than the other airlines. And they said the technology in airplanes are all good. They said the training seems all good. Everything seems normal. There's only one thing that's causing possibly these crashes. They said what? They said Korean culture. What? They said normally when they finished the investigation, they said you have a pilot and a co-pilot. And usually the pilot is senior and the co-pilot is junior. Now, in other airlines, if there is some threat in the air or something that the pilot may not have seen, but the co-pilot saw it, they'll very quickly jump and say, hey, move. But because they said the culture of Korea is two things, it is hierarchical, strictly hierarchical, based on age and experience, and authoritarian. This is the word that they said. So authoritarian is authority. Because of that, rather than the co-pilot, the junior pilot saying, move, they would say, did you see that mountain range? They would ask questions. Or they would say, did you see that thing in the air? So they would not be forceful in their approach of what's there. And because of that, the pilot did not have the help of the co-pilot the way they should have, and so they did not have someone double checking them, and so they would crash more often. This is what they came up with. So now, they said, look, your culture is beautiful, your culture is fantastic, but keep your culture on the ground. When you get off the air, you need to put your culture on ice because it's leading to problems. I went to Lucknow 2020, about 3 years ago, and they were saying there, they said, pehle aap mein train nikal jati hai. This idea that if you're constantly having like, oh no, after you, that's important, it's good adab, it's good akhlaq, but in that process, neither you get on the train, neither I get on the train, we lose out on that. So that has an impact on culture. So now coming back to this, they realized this and they said, look, when it comes to this is the safety of us and the passengers, culture, we need to adjust our culture to meet this needs. Similarly, this is something that you need to realize. When your children ask you a question and they say, Mama, Baba, what's the reason for this? Why this? Can you explain this to me? Sometimes parents get upset. Sometimes parents get frustrated. Sometimes parents say, just because it is. But realize that that child, when they're asking you a question, they are not necessarily asking you a question. They are doing what the co-pilots in Korean Airlines were doing. They are telling you, Mama, Baba, the plane is about to crash. But they're doing it in a way of asking a question to you. And you and I need to wake up to realize that the plane is crashing. Otherwise, once the plane crashes, what are we going to do? And so when you see a question that someone's asking, don't take that lightly. Take it seriously and say, look, we need to be committed to give an answer that is tasalli bakhsh, number one. A question is a gift. It's not something that we should say is something that's a problem. Number one, the Ahlul Bayt would always, they would never get irritated by questions. And sometimes people, example is a lady came to Lady Fatima with questions from her mother. And when she came to Bibi Fatima, she asked one question after the other, to the point that the girl herself got embarrassed. She said, I feel embarrassed to take up more of your time. And Bibi Fatima says, what would you say about someone who is taking a heavy load, a heavy weight on their back and climbing up a mountain, but for every difficulty, they will be rewarded tremendously. So it's a great reward. So that is the reward of the knowledge that Allah has given us. And when we answer your questions, Allah rewards us for this. So don't see it as a burden. Ask away. And she asked at that point. So we should encourage this culture, one side. Number two is, how do you create a safe space for communication? I want to share a story with you that will help you in your family life, hopefully, and life in general. There's a company in America, which I'm sure you've seen its product, so you may have heard of it. But even if you don't know about it, you may have been impacted by its product. It's called Medtronic. Medtronic is a medical device manufacturer in America, and they create things such as cardiac catheters and things like this, things that are used in surgery and other medical environments. So they got a new CEO. The book is called Super Bosses, if you want to check out this reference. The Leaders of Leaders. So this new CEO of this company called Medtronic, he was not a medical technology company. You would think the CEO would either have a medical background or a biomedical engineering background or electric or engineering background in some way. Engineer or doctor or some combination of the two. And so he did not have a background in engineering or in medicine or biomedical engineering. His background was in finance. He was really good with numbers and finance and that part and people. And so he said, I need to figure out and know how our company is doing. I'm saying this for the leadership of the future generation. So you understand how to solve some of the problems that we're facing. This is a leadership issue. He said, look, I said, I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a biomedical engineer. How do I understand truly what our business and our company does? I'm the new leader of the ship. So he said, you know what? I need to go to the field. I need to go to the ground. I need to go where our products and our devices are being used. So he said what? He said, he asked his company's team, the secretary, to arrange for him to be participating and observing in an operation. So this company, Medtronic, created medical devices, and they also had medical sales staff. But the medical sales staff are doctors themselves, medical doctors, who they participate in the surgeries. So if anything goes wrong in the surgery, they know how to fix it. So they can help the other surgeons. So for those who are interested in being surgeons, listen carefully. So now, he said there's one doctor who is willing to have you as an observer in the operation room. And so they set the date, the schedule, and the new CEO said, okay, I'm going to go there on that date, and he gets there. When he gets to the operation room and the operation theater, when he's there, in the operation theater is the main surgeon conducting surgery, the nurse, as well as some other support staff. And also there is the sales manager representative from Medtronic, who works for Medtronic, who's a doctor, whose job is to stay there and make sure the device from Medtronic is working properly. And then, of course, the CEO. And so, when the operation begins, the CEO is observing, he wants to see how the product works, and what it does, and if it works well or not. The first time he's going to the field as the new CEO. And when he gets there, the CEO notices that the surgeon cuts open the patient, opens his chest, and then he begins to make arrangements, and he takes the product from Medtronic, the device, that's a cardiac catheter, he picks it up, and he's about to place it on the patient, when as soon as he picks it up and he's about to place it, he has it over the open patient's body and chest. As soon as he takes it and he's about to put it in the patient, it crumbles and breaks into pieces. The CEO froze. The surgeon, who had it in his hand, he picked up the pieces that fell into the patient, and he put it in his hand, and he took it and he threw it at the CEO's face. And he said, take your product. And he left very upset. And now the CEO is saying, looking at his employee, who's the sales manager, who's the doctor, who's supposed to manage this, he said, what just happened? He took him to the side, and he said, our device crumbled in front of my eyes, your eyes in here, and I'm coming to the floor, and I'm coming to the ground, and I'm coming to the operation theater for the first time, and for the first time I come here, this is what happens? Why am I just finding out about this? Why? Now imagine the owner of your company, your boss comes to you in this tape, and what are you going to do? And so this doctor, very calmly and very securely, looked back at the CEO and he said, oh, this isn't the first time this happened. I said, what? He said, this is the fourth time this has happened. I said, what? He said, it's happened 3 times before. And he said, what did you do when it happened 3 times before? He said, when it happened 3 times before, I did exactly what I'm about to do for the 4th time. So what is it? I wrote a detailed report back to headquarters. The first time, the second time, the third time. And now I'm going to do it again for the 4th time. I've been telling this for a year, nobody's been giving me any response. Then the CEO was even more shocked, so he launched an investigation. And when he launched this investigation, it took a long time to get the honest results back. And what he realized was, what was going on was, when this sales manager, doctor, was sending the report back to headquarters, the report would then go through one layer of management, and then another layer of management, and a third layer of management. And by the time it got to the desk of the CEO, the story was not that our products are problematic. The story was, oh, the customer does not know how to use our product. We just need to train them more. And so he realized that there was such a fear on each level of management that they're going to be blamed for what happened, that they never told the truth. They kept twisting and twisting and twisting up until the problem was, oh, we didn't do anything wrong. The problem's all on the other side. What happens as a result of this is you are not aware of the reality, the haqa'iq. And so what ends up happening is people say, MashaAllah, everything is rosy, gulabi, beautiful, everything's fine. But in reality, that may not be the case. As the poet says, जिसको भी शेख व शाह ने हुक्म खुदा दिया करार, हमने नहीं किया वो काम, हाँ बखुदा नहीं किया, और निस्बत इल्म है बहुत, हाकिम वक्त को अजीज, उसने तो कार जहल भी be-ulama nahi kiya. The history of human being and religions is summed up here. That is, that rulers bought scholar Maulanas and they used them for their own gains. For example, when they wanted to ground up the Shia Muslims during the Ottoman Empire, they got a fatwa from a mufti. And they said, if you don't give the fatwa, we'll get rid of you, we'll get someone else. And then until they got someone who said Shias are kafir, and so somebody wrote it. And so this happened. Or other times, how many times people have been given a check and someone says that, say this or say that. It's not only happened in this time, it's happened in other religions too. If you read the history of England and the Anglican Church, you'll find Henry VIII, the king at the time, he wanted to divorce his wife. And at that time, the Catholic Church said, no way, over our dead body, we'll not allow it. So King Henry VIII said, okay, I'll just start another church, I don't need you anymore. So he started a new church, called the Anglican Church, which made that legitimate. This has been an old practice of kings. The same thing happened during the time of Allama Hilli. The ruler at the time, he divorced his wife. And all of the schools of thought that were other than Ja'fari, they all said, oh, there's nothing. You said it 3 times, it's done. She has to marry someone else and come back to you after that. Divorce him and come back. He said, not happening. Until they said, there's one person who may be able to help you. He is the scholar and the alim of the Rafida, as they used to call him. So Allama Hilli came. And when he came, he said, look, he came with his shoes in hand. And so Allama Hilli was very clever. Even as a young boy, before he was baligh, he used to, sometimes we think someone's a troublemaker. We don't know what will happen afterwards. For example, his father was an alim, he was an alim at a young age, and he had so much knowledge, Allama Hilli, that before he was baligh, he was able to be a marja, someone you could follow, at least mujtahid. So his father used to be chasing him around, who was also an alim, and his father would run around him, and then eventually he would corner him. Allama Hilli's father would corner him. He said, now I got you, I'll get you. And then as soon as he would corner him, Allama Hilli would recite an ayah of the Quran that had wajib sajda. And as soon as he would recite that, his father had to go down into sajda, and he would go around his father and then run away. So he would use his knowledge for betterment. So sometimes you may see someone, a young boy or a young girl, and you think they have too much energy, they're problematic. Rather, you may find that their brain is very active, and in fact, you just need to stimulate them and give them more, because maybe they'll end up like Allama Hilli, inshallah, down the line. So kids are meant to play. Remember, up to 7, they're supposed to be doing that. So we should encourage these things. Also, ilm is important, no doubt. And I've been mentioning this through the nights, but a child is a child. So now come back to this. When it comes to this issue that I just mentioned to you about Medtronic, he realized that there needs to be a safety net and a safe space for people to tell the haqaiq as they are. Otherwise, what will happen is our company will suffer. Similarly, in your community as a leader, similarly in your home as a family, the husband and wife as the leaders of the family, they need to create something called a safe space. You know safe space? Safe space is somewhere where you can say what you're feeling or what's on your mind without a concern of being criticized or someone saying that, Na'udhu billah, astaghfirullah. How did you ask that question? How dare you say that? Astaghfirullah. And the reality of the matter is, the most dangerous question is the question that is not asked. Because that question stays in the heart and the mind, and it brews and brews and brews over time. You know how coffee and tea brews? And sometimes it spills over. And when it spills over, we're seeing people are becoming atheists, agnostics, and many other things are happening. So as a community leader, you need to be aware of this. Now the next thing that I want to mention to you very quickly is how to communicate. There's something called non-violent communication. I invite you to read about this and look at what is violent communication, what's non-violent communication. Also use a technique called the 5 whys. The 5 whys is a technique where you ask the other person why they're saying something, but the way you ask it is very important. You don't say why. You say it in a way that's humble to truly understand what is going on in the minds of the other person. This is a technique we learned in engineering, by the way. And so the idea was, what picture in movie and film is playing in the other person's mind is not necessarily the same one that's playing in your mind. So you have to understand, as a leader, you need to be an expert communicator. You need to understand what is the movie and picture and film that is playing in the other person's mind. And so you ask them, oh, why do you feel that way? Oh, okay, I didn't realize that. So there's some techniques that I want you to understand. One is active listening. Another is reflective listening. Active listening is, in our world today, how do we listen? You have your cell phone and you're typing and out. Oh yeah, okay. Oh yeah, I listen. But you're not really there. You're there, you're not really in front of the other person. There's a book I invite you to read. It's called Alone Together. The title of the book is called Alone Together. And it said this is what we've become in our social media world today. We are all alone, but we're together. Meaning we're all sitting there, but we're alone. And so this is something that we have not fully realized about the dynamics of the world in which we're existing. And it's having an impact on everyone. So one thing is active listening. So when you're talking to somebody, you put the phone down and you have full attention there. It's not easy, but it's important. Number one. Number two is reflective listening. Reflective listening is what? Sometimes when the other person is speaking, we're not listening. We're just thinking, what's our response? What are we going to say to them when it's our turn to speak? That's not listening. That's just hearing. Hearing is just you hear sound. You don't know what they said. Listening is very different. I met the head of sales of IBM. You've heard of IBM? International Business Machines? A huge company. They have the most patents in the world. And I met the head of sales in Europe. And I met him at a conference. And I said, what have you learned about sales? What's the secret to sales? To selling? And he looked at me and he said, listen. And so I turned and I said, what? Yeah, I'm listening. Tell me something. He said, no, that's it. That's the secret. Listen. Most people don't listen. They're just trying to push and push and push. They don't listen. So one way that you can do is reflective listening. Reflective listening is to hear and listen to what the other person said. Then don't respond. Repeat back to them what you think they said. Oh, so you said this? Am I correct in understanding you said this? You said this? And they'll say, first three are right, the last one, I know. I was trying to say something else. This helps two ways. One, you can understand them better, but number two, if they said something ridiculous, they have a moment to think about it and say, oh, I didn't really mean it that way. So it also gives them an opportunity to correct what they said. Remember one thing, my dear brothers and sisters. In the West, we have this old adage that people repeat again and again. And if you remember nothing, remember this. That we're going to fight fire with fire. Have you ever heard of this? Fire with fire. So if this country did this to us, we're going to respond in the same way. If they treated me this way, I'm going to try. Remember, in a family structure, in a community structure, never fight fire with fire. Why? In a family structure, if you fight fire with fire, fire with fire burns the whole house down. You fight fire with water. And you need to be able to know, and I need to be able to know when the other person's on fire, and when to use water, and how I can extinguish the fire, not make it bigger. And these are things that the Ahlul Bayt were trying to teach us. This is why Rasulullah says, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأَتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I've been sent to give you and teach you the perfect moral conduct. But sometimes when you come to our Husayniyas or Imam Bargas and you see how people act, or even the leadership sometimes, alhamdulillah, here people have been fantastic, but other places perhaps, you find that you're like, this is the leadership, the akhlaq is bankrupt, sometimes akhlaq is bankrupt, sometimes the way, the adab is bankrupt, sometimes the people are bankrupt in terms of akhlaq. And so the young person growing up says, do I really want to be part of this? Is this what Islam is about? And that's where we need to make sure akhlaq, adab, ihtiram, these things are maintained as the Ahlul Bayt taught us. How did they speak to their children? Sometimes we have this idea, as a father I should be strict. Sure, as a father you should be loving first. Rasulullah is the same one who also used to pick up Imam Hassan and Hussein and kiss them, for example. So that's also very important. So how to have reflective listening. Another thing is to get to the root of the problem. In America, where I'm coming from, maybe here too, I know the UK, in our communities, divorces are on the skyrise. They are shooting up. I don't know how it is here, but it's happening. And so when that happens, it really hurts the children especially, and it can hurt the spouses and the couple as well. And so we need to understand, how do we take the culture we came from, understand what was good about that, and also understand the culture in which we've come in, what's good about that, and what may not be so good, and how do we reconcile different. You know, in America, many of the challenges that I'm facing, believe it or not, are not due to husband and wife. Many of the challenges are due to in-laws. The parents of the father, of the husband, or the parents of the mother. Now, the expectations need to be managed here. What do I mean? Your kids and your children growing up in Australia or growing up in America or Canada or the United Kingdom or wherever you're hearing my voice, they're not growing up in the culture that you grew up in. They're growing up in a completely different culture. So when you set expectations on them from a different culture, they're saying, Mama, what do you expect from me? Because they don't even know what you're expecting from them. So, for example, a man came to Rasulullah during the time Rasulullah stayed sitting with all his companions, and he puts his hand on Rasulullah's beard and he pulls it. And everyone got so upset, all the companions. He said, hold on. This is his culture where he's come from. That's how they give their salam. That's how they pay their respect. That's their culture. You don't know it, I know it, so he does not need to be disrespectful. So the same way, when you live in these different dynamics, how do you reconcile these things? In a place like Australia and America, they have the term called boundaries. And boundaries is the basis that, hey, I know some relatives, and sometimes you go to some extremes. I remember some of my relatives used to say that when they first came to the US, maybe in the 50s and 60s, at that time, and they used to someone would come from the airport, and they would come from the airport, they'd come to the house, and they'd come like without calling or uninvited. Now in Pakistan, for example, family, they'll come up to the door uninvited. Maybe not anymore, but at that time they did. And then these other people who had been there for a few years, they would open the door and then close the door and say, call and come back. The idea was that this is a different culture. Who's right, who's wrong? These are two different cultures. But you need to be aware of that. Similarly, when it comes to husband and wife, you may come from a society where what the husband says, the wife has to listen to. But in a society like Australia and America, that's not the case. In the United Kingdom, that's not the case. They'll say, you have a term here in Australia, it's called mateship. Mate. You use this term? M-A-T-E. I know the young ones do. Where did that come from? That came from the culture of the historical background of people who came here, and they laid that. Some of them were prisoners and criminals historically, and they also abided by the code of thieves, for example. They said, we don't want a big government over us. We want to have the sense of mateship and egalitarianism. So they say today that extends to women also, for sure. So women have just as many rights as men do. Now when it comes to the Ahlul Bayt, its principle was mutual love and respect. As I mentioned, Lady Khadija was a businesswoman and entrepreneur, but she had a tremendous love and respect for Rasulullah, and vice versa. Rasulullah had tremendous love and respect for Khadija salamullahi alayha, to the point that he cried so much when she died. Or if you go to Imam Ali alayhi salam, Bibi Fatima, they had this relationship of mutual love and respect for one another. And so having said that, in an environment where the society says you don't need families, we need to show people why it's in their betterment to have families, and why it's good, and why it's important to not say who I win or you win, or it's not about winning. It's about how do we get closer. Remember, and never forget the analogy of the battle and the war. The battle and the war. And strategy along with it. There was a general by the name of Hannibal. Hannibal is a military general who has studied in all the major military institutions and even business and government institutions. They study him because I want to say something very quickly before we go to Masai. And he was someone who was from Carthage, or he was a Carthaginian general. And on the other side, he had the Roman army against him that was a huge army. And his army was a smaller army. And so he had to figure out, how does he take this army that is a smaller army and defeat this much larger army? So he studied the other army on the other side. And he said, I know that when they come to battle, they come in a rectangle shape or a square shape, even on each side. And the Romans, they put their strongest men in the front line. So he said, what can I do with this information? So he came up with a decision and a plot and a strategy. So he said, I'm going to put my men in the back, sort of in a V or a U shape, and in the front I will have one line, and in the middle will be empty. So think of like a V shape. So in the back it will be like two lines, and in the front it will be one line. It will be like a V or a triangle with the base in the front and the point at the end. And so what he did was, Hannibal put his strongest men on the side, his strongest warriors on the side, and he put his weakest men in the front. And when the battle began, the enemies are approaching each other, and the Romans are in the rectangular shape, the square shape, with their strongest men at the front, and they come head to head with the first line of Hannibal, and Hannibal has put his weakest men. And when this happens, the Roman army's strongest men, they destroy Hannibal's first line. If you stop the war and the battle at that time, 2,000 years ago, if you stop the battle at that time, you would think the Romans have won and Hannibal's army has lost. But they fell right into Hannibal's trap. What was his trap? His trap was, as soon as they crossed the weak line, the strongest men from the Roman army all entered into the empty space of Hannibal's army. And all the other people funneled in as well. So what happened was, the strongest warriors in Hannibal's army became surrounded by their own men. And on the outside, the people from Hannibal's army, the strongest men, began to pinch and destroy like scissors and come into the other army. The strongest men from Hannibal's army were now useless, because there were thousands of their own comrades who were surrounding them, and the weakest men were on the outside. And so what happened was, in a matter of 4 to 5 hours, Hannibal's army destroyed the entire Roman army. This is what I'm telling you about strategy. What I mean by that is, in strategy, if you look at Imam Hussein alayhi salam, if you paused and cut the clock at 61 AH on Roze Ashura, on the day of Ashura, on the time of Asr, and you said, I'm going to stop the clock here, you would think in your short-sightedness that Yazid has won. But history and time said that the victory would be Hussein's. But why? The history was there because, not just because of Hussein. The reality is, Ghadir had how many people that were witness there? Our ulama say this. 124,000 plus people were at Ghadir. But no one remembered Ghadir. They all said we forgot Ghadir. But when it came to Karbala, 72 companions and some relatives in the whole world commemorates it, from corner to corner, or from Australia to Antarctica to Alaska to Russia and everywhere in between. Why? And one of the reasons the ulama say is that Ghadir did not have Zainab. Zainab is the ambassador of Karbala, in the sense that she's the one who made sure that that message was kept alive. Of course, Imam Sajjad is also there, but Imam Sajjad is keeping on imamah. And because of the illness, he's not fighting. But Sayyidah Zainab is the one who made that movement alive. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. Where we have strong leadership in the form of Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, Rasulullah, Imam Ali, we have strong women leaders, such as Bibi Khadija, such as Bibi Fatima, such as Bibi Zainab. And our ulama say their traits are not traits of weakness. What I mean is this. I'm not here to say that we should put the rights, all the rights are for men, all the rights are for women. All the rights, we need to have them balanced for everyone. And we need to say, if the men are suffering, that's a problem. If the women are suffering, that's a problem for the family structure. So knowing how to communicate, to understand the real problems, is something that can help us. And when it came to Zainab salamullahi alayha, at times Zainab is the leader. Of course, she always did the ita'at of the Imam. And she always listened and asked Imam Hussein and Imam Sajjad what to do. But when it came to the women at times, she was leading that caravan in certain elements. Imam Sajjad was, of course, the real leader in terms of the imamat and other aspects. But no one can ever diminish and reduce the leadership qualities and power of Zainab al-Kubra. Zainab is an institution in herself. You know, Bibi Zainab used to teach in Medina. And although she had no need to, she would teach Quran. And she would teach Islam. And women used to come to her house and they used to learn from her what Islam truly is. So these were great ladies who were teachers as well as leaders, and of course they were mothers. And mothers are leaders in themselves. I'll give you an example. In America, we have this brand called 5 Hour Energy. I don't know if you have it here, but it's an energy drink. The owner of it was an Indian guy who's a billionaire. And so they asked him to come speak at a big conference on leadership and management. And he got to the mic, and they were like, what is he going to say? You know, this huge entrepreneur, businessman, owner. He said, you want to learn management? You want to learn leadership? They said, yes. He said, look at mothers. Mothers? What? He said, mothers. They have these children that they're looking, all these children, they're running around, they have a fixed budget, they have to make things work, they're doing some complicated things to make some of these things work. Now that doesn't mean the husband and the man is not doing anything. Remember, and I told you this earlier on in the lecture as well, we need to have compassion and love on both sides. If the male is also suffering, the family structure is suffering. There's 2 pillars that are holding up the family. It's the husband and the wife, the mother and the father. And we need to show why it's so important. And by the way, the data and research is very clear on this with respect to mothers. And the data has never been clearer in terms of you need strong fathers in order to have strong daughters. There's a book I recommend you read if you're a father and you have a daughter. It's called Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters. And it tells you what happens if the father is not in the daughter's life. And they've also written another book, Strong Mothers, Strong Sons. That relationship is extremely important as well. And in that environment, if we have an environment where the father is playing both roles, or the mother is playing both roles, it's very difficult, number one. Number two, the children may pay a price. And that's where we need to come in and say, how do we teach communication? How do we teach love, respect, empathy? And what it is the other person really wants off the time. I mentioned this. I don't know when I'll be back or life will have this again, but remember, many of the fights that happen between husband and wife, for those who are married or going to get married or plan on it, they happen because of a phenomenon called hanger. You know hanger? Hanger is anger that is induced by hunger. The other person's hungry, and you don't know it, and then they get angry at you, and then you start getting angry at them, where the problem could have been solved by just eating something. So before you start a fight, just ask the other person, have you had a bite to eat or not? Or you need some water, or you need something that may solve 90% of your problems. The same way that they say 90% of headaches are caused by dehydration, that's one aspect. The other aspect is, see what's going on behind the surface. Many times when people say something, the reason, when I got married, and many brothers will know this, sisters do something called venting. Have you heard of venting? Venting is when they just want to tell you all the problems there, but they don't want a solution. So they tell us the problem, and we put on our hat like engineer, doctor, we're like, okay, you do this is it, and then the problem will be solved. And she doesn't want a solution. She just wants you to hear her and know that you care. That's all she wants. And so the first several years of marriage, many people, now sometimes she may want a solution. So these are things where the community can come in and have workshops, seminars, discussions, to call professionals in the community and say, hold on a second, your quality of life can be so beautiful if you just learn a thing or two here. I mentioned Gottman, there's the 5 languages of love and others. By the way, these are things our Ahlul Bayt emphasize. But sometimes we don't look at it that way, we don't see it that way. I remind you, Rasulullah is the one who said, a man who tells his wife that he loves him, loves her, will find that statement will never leave her heart. So this is Rasulullah, or Rasulullah kissing Imam Hassan or Hussein when it was not customary to do that at the time. They were changing the culture for the better to show affection. And there are elements today we know of leadership that men may have that they're good at, and there are certain elements of leadership that maybe women are good at. For example, men may be good in certain aspects, for sure. But there's other aspects. There's one commentator who was saying, if you want to get rid of all the wars in the world, just make women make them the leaders. And then some have commented on that. I won't tell you what their sub-commentary on that. But I'll give you a real example. When COVID happened, one of the things that people were studying was women-led states and countries did better. For example, New Zealand. New Zealand's leadership was hailed as doing really well in the COVID issue. In America, Michigan had a female leader, the state of Michigan, and they did much better relative to the rest of society. So now they're saying there may be some elements that require paternal leadership and some require maternal leadership. And believe me, I At times you definitely need the mother, but at times you definitely also need the father. And that's where we need to understand how to communicate effectively. And that effective communication between husband and wife, hopefully the children will learn. Non-violent communication, such that it's safe. So that you feel that the other person's, sometimes we use our language as something that we use against the other person. But if that happens, there's not clear and good communication. Culture, communication, love, compassion, ethics, all of these have been mentioned. The Quran has used terms such as this, as I will conclude here. Allah says, what's that ayah that I recited in the earlier parts of this lecture series? وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. Allah says that I ordained and I command on you, do not associate anyone with me, and do good to your parents. Imam as-Sadiq was asked, what does it mean to do good to your parents? He said, someone, a young person here may say, my mom and my dad, they bugged me and they bothered me, and then eventually I cleaned my room. I did good. I did what they said. After 2 hours, I did it. Imam Sad says, in the Quran, when it says, do good to your parents, it means do what they need you to do what they need you to do that you know before they ask you to do it. There's many things that your parents are going to ask you to do. They're going to ask you to clean your room. They're going to ask you to, maybe read the Quran. Whatever they ask you to do it before they ask you to do it. If they have to ask you, you miss the bus, you miss the train. So do it before they have to ask you those things that you know they're going to ask you to do. And there's many of those things. But at the same time, when you raise children, they're your children. And if you're intelligent, they're going to be intelligent as well. In fact, they'll be doubly intelligent. They have the intelligence of the mother and the father. And so we need to be mindful of their own self-esteem and how to build that. And the Ahlul Bayt teaches this. So but this ayah doesn't end here. The other part of the ayah I didn't mention. The ayah continues that don't associate anyone with Allah, respect your parents. In our paradigm, respect of parents is vital. And then next is وَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا أُفٍّ. Do not say the word uff. Do not even say the word uff to your parents. And then use what? قَوْلًا كَرِيمًا. The Quran says. Use a generous tone with them, a generous word with them. So you don't talk to them arrogantly. Another place, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, as I remind you, He told Musa, speak to Pharaoh how? قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا, soft tone, so that he'll listen. In other places, the Quran says, use قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا means that which is honorable words, especially when you're speaking to your spouse. So when there's disrespect, many husbands that I've been dealing with, many of the things that they say is the first thing it boils down to, they feel disrespected. And then they say, when I feel disrespected, it's not productive. Similarly, if the wife feels unloved, she also needs respect, vitally, no doubt. And I'm not pulling this from my pocket. This is Christian writers also have written on this. You can read a book by Dr. Eggerichs, it's called Love and Respect. And he said in the Bible, it's clear that when it comes to love and respect, both are needed for both, but primary for men is often respect and for women is often love. And so these things that may not have been so important, although they should have been important in other places, you and I need to cultivate it so the next generation knows. That's how you give rise to a next generation. It is Khadija and Rasulullah who give rise to Fatima al-Zahra. It is the likes of Ali and Fatima who give rise to Hassan and Hussein and Zainab. And that's where we need to make sure that we understand how we can have strong family structures by understanding culture, by understanding communication. And then we'll give it. That's why the poet says, Khatm hai fasl kaman, bol rahi hai Zainab. Kaun bolega jahan, bol rahi hai Zainab. और तीरों शमशीरों सिनाहों के सितम के लश्कर थक गई सबकी ज़बान बोल रही है ज़ैनब और चुन रहा है अदब नहज बलागा अल्फाज चुन रहा है अदब नहज बलागा अल्फाज अपने बाबा की ज़बान बोल रही है ज़ैनब अपने बाबा की ज़बान बोल रही है ज़ैनब और ऐ यजीद इससे बड़ी हार तेरी क्या होगी ऐ यजीद इससे बड़ी हार तेरी क्या होगी वो तेरा घर है जहां बोल रही है ज़ैनब وہ تیرا گھر ہے جہاں بول رہی ہے زینب. The audacity, the rhetoric and the ability of eloquence, of balagha, that Ali ibn Abi Talib, Imam Ali taught, became the fruit that was Zainab sallallahu alayhi. That nobody could speak in front of Zainab. When she was speaking, there was pin drop silence. And all of the blades and arrows and everything, they were useless in front of Sayyida Zainab's word. کربلا سے ثانی زہرا کو شام تک, کربلا سے ثانی زہرا کو شام تک, ایسی سپاہ ایسا رسالہ نہیں ملا. نیزوں کے وار روکنے والے بہت ملے, خطبوں کا وار روکنے والا کوئی نہیں ملا. This idea that there was no one to stop Sayyida Zainab's words that she was saying. They were like swords cutting the enemy. And that's where that comes from. Tonight is the soil of Imam Hussein, the third afterwards. This is the night and the day where Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam was actually buried. Ajrukum ala Allah, azadaro khatm kiya. Bas 2 minute ki zahmat. پتہ نہیں کون سے دن رہتے ہیں یا نہیں رہتے. سوئے میں امام حسین آ گئی. امام حسین جو 3 دن تک بے غسل و کفن دشت کربلا پر پڑے رہے, جو اہل البیت بیان کرتے ہیں, سلام ہو حسین پر جس کا غسل خون میں حسین تھا اور جس کا کفن خاک کربلا تھا. اجرکم علی اللہ. جب 3 دن آئے تو پھر بنو اسد کے قبیلے نے, جو امام نے کہا تھا ان سے کہ یہ کچھ دن کے بعد یہاں پر جنگ ہوگی اور کچھ دن کے بعد ہماری لاشیں یہاں پر پڑے رہیں گے, اگر کچھ کر سکو تم مردو ہمیں دفن کر دینا, ہمارے جسموں پر خاک ڈال دینا. اور پھر کہا کہ حتیٰ کہ اگر کچھ نہ ہو سکے, امام نے بچوں کو مخاطب کیا اور کہا ہے بچوں, اگر تمہارے والدین یہ کام نہ کر پائے کیونکہ مجبوری ہو یا کوئی وجہ ہو, تم کھیلتے کھیلتے ہمارے جسموں پر کچھ خاک ڈال دینا. امام نے یہ بندوبست کیا. کتنا سخی امام تھا, کتنا کریم امام تھا کہ زمین کربلا خرید کے وقف کر دیا. اور اتنا ہی کہا ان لوگوں سے, انہوں نے عہد کو, انہوں نے کوشش کی کہ وفا کریں تو آئے, اور جب آئے انہوں نے چاہا کہ جسموں کو ان پر خاک ڈالی جائے اور ان کو مرتب میں ڈالا جائے, مگر ایک امتحان تھا ان کا. وہ امتحان کیا تھا کہ شہداء کے جسموں پر سر نہ تھے, تو کیسے پتا چلتا کہ کون کون ہے. اتنے میں جب بنو اسد کا قبیلہ یہ منظر دیکھ رہا تھا, دور سے شام سے آگے آتے ہوئے انہوں نے ایک نظارہ دیکھا, کوئی گھوڑا سوار آ رہا تھا. انہوں نے کہا کہ شاید شام سے کوئی آ رہا ہے, یزید کی جانب سے, کہ شام والے تو وہی کے ہیں. انہوں نے کہا کہ چھپا جائے, ہٹا جائے, کیونکہ اگر انہوں نے دیکھا کہ ہم عزت و احترام کر رہے ہیں اور ہم کم سے کم یہ کوشش کر رہے ہیں کہ شہداء کے جسموں کی بے حرمتی نہ ہو, تو وہ پھر ہم پر تشدد کریں, ہم پر ظلم کریں, تو وہ ہٹ گئے. اور جب ہٹ گئے تو دور سے کیا دیکھا, امام سجاد آ رہے ہیں باعجاز امامت, سید الساجدین امام زین العابدین پہنچے زمین کربلا پر اور سلام کیا بنو اسد کے قبیلے کو. انہوں نے بھی واپس سلام کیا. امام نے کہا کہ ماجرا کیا ہے, جانتے ہیں امام وقت ہے, مگر تاکہ ہم اور آپ کو پتہ چل جائے. یہ کہا اے ابن زہرا, کہا فرزند رسول, ہم نے چاہا کہ ان لاشوں کو دفنا دیا جائے, مگر ان کے تن سر سے جدا ہے, ان کے سر اقدس جسم پر نہیں. ہم کیسے پتہ چلائے, ہم کیسے پتہ کریں کہ کون کون ہے. اجرکم اللہ. امام سجاد نے کہا پر بتایا کہ یہ اصحاب کے لاشیں ہیں، مگر آخر پھر آئے اور پھر وہ بنو ہاشم کا خاندان، وہ آل محمد، ان کے لاشیں بھی دفن کرنے آئے تھے۔ امام نے کہا یہ آل محمد کے لاشیں، یہ پامال ہوا لاشا، یہ قاسم ابن حسن کا لاشا ہے۔ ایک بہ ایک امام بتاتے گئے اور لاشیں اکٹھے ہوتے گئے، حتیٰ کہ مرحلہ یہ آیا کہ اب امام نے فرات کا رخ کیا، کہا میرے ساتھ، اور جب فرات کی جانب پہنچے تو امام نے اپنے دامن میں کچھ جسم کے اعضاء اکٹھے کرنے لگے۔ انہوں نے کہا یہ کیا ماجرا ہے؟ انہوں نے فرمایا یہ میرے چچا عباس کا لاشا جو اشقیا نے انہیں ٹکڑے ٹکڑے کر دیا۔ علماء بیان کرتے ہیں کہ عباس کا لاشا جو ہمیں ملا وہ کسی بچے کی لاشے سے زیادہ نہ تھا، مرکز عباس کی بہت چھوٹی نظر آئی، حالانکہ عباس بہت قداور تھے۔ یہ قیامت امام سجاد نے دیکھی، اجرکم اللہ، حتیٰ کہ یہ مرحلہ آیا کہ پھر امام سجاد نے کہا کہ کچھ لاشیں رہتے ہیں، میں چاہوں گا کہ یہ لاشا یہاں اور ایک لاشا قبر کے پیروں کے قریب امام حسین ایک لاشا رکھا جائے۔ انہوں نے کہا یہ کون سا لاشا ہے؟ انہوں نے کہا یہ علی اکبر کا لاشا ہے جو حسین کے ساتھ ساتھ دفنا دیا جائے۔ اور پھر امام حسین کو بھی دفنایا گیا۔ امام سجاد نے کہا یہ فریضہ میرا ہے، یہ امامت میں نبھاؤں گا، اس کو یہ عمل مجھے کرنا ہے، کیونکہ ایک معصوم کو دفن کرتا ہے۔ خدا جانے کہ امام سجاد نے اپنے بابا کو کیسے دفن کیا، مگر اس سے پہلے کہتے ہیں ایک ذاکر تھا جو ایک دن مسائل پڑھتے پڑھتے اس سے پوچھا گیا کہ وہ ششماہا وہ کہاں دفن ہوا، وہ 6 مہینے والا وہ علی اصغر وہ کہاں دفن ہوا؟ انہوں نے فرمایا یہ معلوم نہیں مجھے پتا نہیں، میں نے مقتل میں نہیں دیکھا۔ حتیٰ کہ جب وہ گھر پہنچا تو اس کی آنکھ لگی، اور جب آنکھ لگی تو منظر میں کیا دیکھا، امام ہے اور ایک جملہ فرماتے ہیں کہ میرے عزاداروں سے کہہ دو کہ وہ ششماہا وہ 6 مہینے والا وہ علی اصغر میرے سینے پہ سو رہا ہے، حسین ابن علی کے سینے پہ سو رہا ہے۔ اجرکم علی اللہ، امام سجاد نے گویا حضرت علی اصغر کو سینہ امام حسین میں رکھا اور دفن کیا، اور پھر چاہا کہ قبر پہ کچھ لکھا جائے۔ ہم اور آپ جب اپنے اعزاء اور اقارب کو دفن کرتے ہیں تو کچھ لکھتے ہیں قبر پر، کتنا اچھا باپ تھا، کتنا محبت والا تھا، کتنا خیال رکھنے والا تھا، جو دل پہ گزر رہی ہے وہی لکھتے ہیں۔ مگر علماء بیان کرتے ہیں کہ ایک چیز تھی جو آل محمد کبھی بھول نہ پائے، وہ کیا تھا؟ اور وہ استدلال قائم کرتے ہیں اس کا کہ جب روز عاشور ہوئی تو سب سے پیاسا کون تھا، اور اس کی 3 دلیلیں دیتے ہیں۔ ایک کہتے ہیں کہ جب علی اصغر کس کا فرزند ہوں، میں ساقی کوثر کا لال ہوں، میں بتا دیتا وہ کریم ابن کریم حسین کے پاس ایک بوند پانی بھی نہ تھا. کہا بیٹا اپنی زبان میرے منہ میں ڈال دو. علی اکبر نے کہا بابا آپ کی زبان تو میری زبان سے بھی خشک ہے. امام نے اپنی انگشتری منہ میں علی اکبر کے ڈالی اور کہا بیٹا ساقی کوثر تجھے سیراب کرے. یہ پہلا دلیل. دوسرا کہتے ہیں کہ جب زلجرا آیا اور جب زلجرا آیا لہو لہان خون کے ساتھ جب آیا قتل امام حسین کے بعد شہادت امام حسین کے بعد بی بی نے دیکھا اور کہا ایک ہی جملہ انہوں نے کہا اے زلجنا حل سقیا ابی ام قتلت شانا. اے زلجنا بس اتنا بتا دے کیا میرے بابا کو پانی ملا یا نہیں ملا. اجرکم اللہ. یہی ایام رہتے ہیں. فرصہ دیجیے عالم محمد کو دعائیں مانگیے. یہ دوسری دلیل. تیسری دلیل یہ منظر ہے جس تک میں آپ کو پہنچایا. جب امام سجاد دفن کر چکے سید الشہداء کو انہوں نے چاہا کہ کچھ لکھے. کیا لکھا؟ اپنی انگوٹھی سے امام نے قبر حسین پہ لکھا ہذا قبر الحسین الذی قتلوہ عطشانا. یہ حسین ابن علی کی قبر ہے جو پیاسا ذبح کر دیا گیا. امام سجاد کے دل میں ایک ہی بات تھی، ہائے میرا پیاسا بابا، میرا بابا. سب سے زیادہ شدت پیاس روز عاشورا حسین ابن علی ابن ابی طالب. اور آخری زحمت، اس کے بعد زحمت نہیں مگر حق نہیں ہوگا اگر ان ماؤں کا ذکر نہ ہو. وہ مائیں جو سویم پہ کربلا نہ پہنچ سکی، وہ مائیں جو اپنے بچوں کو فرات کے کنارے کربلا میں چھوڑا ہی، جو رسم بستہ کربلا سے کوفہ و شام تلک پھرائی گئی، وہ ماؤں کے دل پہ کیا گزری ہوگی. فروا کے دل سے پوچھئے قاسم ابن الحسن کے بارے میں، اور پوچھئے اور محمد کے بارے میں زینب سے، پوچھئے لیلا کے بارے میں، لیلا کو علی اکبر کے بارے میں. یہ مائیں تھی کربلا کی جنہوں نے کربلا کا پیغام جاری و ساری رکھا. آخری بات اور خاص طور سے ایک ماں، وہ رباب علی اصغر کی ماں اور رباب سکینہ کی ماں کہ موت کی آغوش میں جب تھک کے سو جاتی ہے ماں، تب کہیں جا کر رضا تھوڑا سکون پاتی ہے ماں، اور یہ سمجھا سکتی ہے ہم کو بس رباب خستتان کس طرح بن دودھ کے بچے کو بہلاتی ہے ماں، کس طرح بن دودھ کے بچے کو بہلاتی ہے ماں. اور قید خانے میں جو مر جائے کوئی بچی یتیم، ادجلے کرتے میں بچی کو کفناتی ہے ماں، ادجلے کرتے. اور ایک بچہ کربلا میں، ایک بچی شام میں، ایک بچہ کربلا میں، ایک بچی شام میں، ہاتھ خالی گود خالی گھر کو آ جاتی ہے ماں. صلی اللہ علیہ یا رسول اللہ صلی اللہ علیہ یا امیر المؤمنین صلی اللہ علیہ یا فاطمة الزہراء سیدۃ النساء العالمین صلی اللہ علیہ یا حسن المجتبی السلام علی الحسین وعلى آل الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين وعلى السادات الطيبين وعلى أهل أسرار سيد الشهداء وسلم کی کوشش اسے ہمیں عطا فرما اللہ ظہور امام تعجیل فرما ہمیں ان کے اعوان اور انسان میں شمار فرما میں شکر گزار ہوں یہاں کے انتظامیہ کا کہ انہوں نے مسلسل مجھے یہاں پر خطاب کرنے کا موقع دیا اور شرکت امام حسین علیہ السلام کی مجلس میں شرکت کا موقع دیا اور میرے ساتھ اگر کوئی خامی ہو کوئی غلطی ہو میں آپ سب مومنین سے دس وسطہ نسبتوں کے مجھے معاف فرمائیے گا میں چھوٹا بھائی ہوں اور انشاءاللہ دعا کیجیے گا کہ خدا نے جو بھی کوشش ہے طالب علم کے طور پر خدا کی حفاظت فرمائے گا اور ہمارے والدین کی بھی دعا کیجیے گا آپ سب ہماری دعاؤں میں ہیں اور ہم بے پناہ محبتیں لے کے جا رہے ہیں عالم محمد کے ہفتے میں اور ایسے مومنین ملے ہیں ماشاء اللہ جو دل خوش ہو گیا کہ اس طرح ہمارا جو فیوچر ہے وہ کافی برائٹ ہے انشاءاللہ ان کے ساتھ اور قیادت کے ساتھ تو مجھے بھی دعاؤں میں رکھیے گا خاص طور سے یہ جو مجلس امام حسین منعقد کرتے ہیں اور اس میں تانے دارم سخن جس حال سے اس میں شرکت کرتے ہیں خدا ہم سب کو سلامت رکھے بہت شکریہ